Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Nina Chennai. I'm a visiting scholar at AEI, and my colleague, Senior Brookings Fellow Josh Meltzer, and I are really pleased to welcome you and our distinguished panelists today to our AEI Brookings program on the future of global trade, U.S. trade policy in the Joe Biden era and beyond. This program is part of a joint bipartisan AEI Brookings project that Josh and I co-lead, titled Reconceptualizing Globalization. And this project seeks to bring innovative thinking to improve the understanding of the importance of international trade and investment for jobs and growth, as well as the impact of globalization on the US economy. We're really delighted to have with us today 4 panelists representing a variety of viewpoints across the political spectrum. In the order that they will deliver their remarks, we've got Chad Bown, who is Reginald Jones Senior Fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. His research examines international trade laws and institutions, trade negotiations and disputes. And with Samaya Keynes, he co-hosts Trade Talks, a weekly podcast on the economics of international trade policy. Actually, one of my favorite podcasts, Chad. Bown previously served as a senior economist for international trade and investment in the White House on the Council of Economic Advisors, and most recently as a lead economist at the World Bank. Next, we have Rob Howse, who is Lloyd C. Nelson Professor of International Law at NYU Law School. A renowned international law scholar, Professor Howse has been a member of the faculty at the World Trade Institute at Bown, Burn's Masters in International Law and Economics program, amongst a whole variety of other positions. And he's frequently a consultant or advisor to government agencies and international organizations such as the OECD and World Bank. Professor Howse is the author, co-author, and co-editor of numerous books as well. Next, we have with us Stephen Vaughn, who is a partner at the law firm of King & Spalding. Stephen most recently prior to this current role, was the general counsel at the U.S. Trade Representative's office during the Trump administration. And while at USTR, Stephen was directly involved in numerous significant issues, including the new U.S.-Canada-Mexico agreement, the USMCA, actions undertaken by the U.S. against China pursuant to Section 301 of the Trade Act of 1974, as well as supervising litigation before the World Trade Organization and other free trade agreements. And before working at USTR, Stephen spent almost 2 decades in private practice representing clients in high-profile trade matters. Last but not least, we have David Dollar, who is a senior fellow at John L. Thornton China Center at the Brookings Institution and host of Brookings Trade podcast, Dollars and Cents. He's a leading expert on China's economy and U.S.-China economic relations. And before joining Brookings, David was the U.S. Treasury's economic and financial emissary to China based in Beijing. And he's worked in numerous other positions, and his current publications focus on economic reform in China, globalization, and economic growth. So let me take this opportunity up front in this program to frame up what we hope will be really a rich, timely conversation today. There's a lot being written these days on what the Biden administration's trade policy may look like. This is clearly important given all the challenges we have ahead in this space. But today, we also want to discuss what the future of global trade may look like and how the Biden administration can put the U.S. on a path towards a more productive, thoughtful approach to trade. Earlier this fall, Josh and I had published an article at the East Asia Forum in which we noted that COVID-19 has become a Rorschach test for all sorts of hopes and fears about globalization. On the one hand, it has accelerated pre-existing trends, such as concerns over the rise of China, the U.S. turn inwards, and increased protectionism. On the other hand, the experience with COVID has highlighted the need for global cooperation to address the unprecedented challenges faced by the globe and the importance of U.S. leadership in solutions. In reality, we have a global trading system that is teetering. After 70 plus years of providing the bedrock of unprecedented growth, prosperity, poverty alleviation in the post-World War II area, the World Trade Organization is under severe strain. Over 19 trillion of annual good flows, and this is not to mention the trillions of dollars of services and investment that flow globally, depend on predictable rules and market access negotiated over the years through first the general agreements on tariffs and trade, and then the World Trade Organization. However, the WTO has struggled to stay relevant, as no real negotiations have occurred for nearly 20 years, and rules haven't kept pace with the fast developments in cutting-edge areas of global commerce. Importantly, the organization and rules have faced a credibility gap by being unable to constrain China's economic and trade practices, among other things. The Trump administration standoff regarding the appointment of members to the World Trade's appellate body has additionally hamstrung the dispute settlement process, which has been considered really the crown jewels of this institution for some years now. So domestically, the politics around trade are complex and evolving. So perhaps the most significant change under the current administration has been the willingness not only to unilaterally raise tariffs against China, but also allies like the EU, Canada, in pursuit of trade objectives. And at the same time, the USMCA was passed with overwhelming bipartisan support in Congress, and that's the US-Mexico-Canada trade agreement, the successor to NAFTA. At the same time, USMCA, at the same time, Pew polling suggests that some of the highest levels of trade, support for trade exists right now, and the trend is upwards. But President Trump's protectionist message on trade has also resonated with other Americans. This raises questions about whether we're going to see a realignment of support for trade amongst political parties and what this may mean for the future of trade policy and US global leadership on trade. Josh and I had made some proposals at the end of that recent article I just mentioned about how we might move forward. Of most relevance to this panel, the first one was that the US should lead a reset of trade rules. And the second was that the US should revert to high standard bilateral or plurilateral trade deals. Given the current state of things, we come from the standpoint that visionary but realistic thinking is likely needed on the future of the global trading system, as well as US trade policy. In other words, we're less sanguine that the incremental reforms, things like WTO dispute settlement reform on their own, will really get at the fundamental issues that are plaguing the system. The Biden administration has signaled a more traditional approach to US trade, at least in terms of support for multilateralism and working with allies, but also with a focus on Buy America type policies. A key question here is, what does this look like in practice, given the range of challenges, and what is needed for US longer term, what is needed for the US longer term to build a politically sustainable approach to trade policy? We hope that this event could contribute to and help drive some thinking and conversations in this regard. So we're going to ask our panelists today to look into a crystal ball and prognosticate on the future of global trade. Each of the panelists will speak for about 8 to 10 minutes, and then we'll have a conversation among the panelists and then turn to audience Q&A. And for those questions, please use Twitter hashtag AskAEIEcon or email john.kearns, Kearns, @aei.org. So without further ado, I'll ask Chad Bown to kick things off.
Thanks, Nina and Josh, for organizing this, for asking me to be a part of it. And it's a great pleasure to be here with you and to share the stage with such a distinguished panel of experts and practitioners and folks that have been working in the heart of these issues for a very, very long time. What I thought I would try to touch on were topics in the kind of nexus of US-China, WTO, with maybe a little bit of Europe thrown in on the side. And while I do want to kind of get us toward the aspirational, because I think there's probably no better time than a beginning of an administration to kind of do that, to set out the things that you might want to get done if you were unencumbered by reality. I think it's also important that we have to actually confront reality. And so what I thought I would do is to start us off with a little bit of dose of the reality of the trading system that the Biden administration inherits, which is obviously very different from where the Obama administration left things in 2016, opportunities, but also challenges. And this is the reality. So, I think one of the things that President-elect Biden has said that he wants to do, maybe that's different from what the Trump administration had done, is to work with allies and use trade as part of the arsenal of foreign policy, but doing so in a way that works with allies, right? You hear this a lot, like-minded countries. I guess the first question is, well, who are these countries, and what does it mean? How do you define yourself as being like-minded or not? And I think that's a critical issue. But the other kind of substantive one is, well, okay, but to work with allies, that means they're going to have to need to be willing to do stuff. And it's not as if we've never attempted to work with allies before. Over the last 4 years, the bilateral approach and unilateral approach, say, toward China was very much going at it alone without allies. But what that meant was it very much took them off the hook for actually having to put some skin in the game, to contribute, to actually think too hard about what it would mean to engage in the same way that the United States was engaging with China in a confrontational way. And so I think that's the first question: is what are allies willing to do, perhaps now, that they haven't been willing to do in the past, right? And I think, to the Trump administration's credit, they've moved allies and like-minded countries, however you define them, to a point where maybe when it comes to challenges like China, perhaps even the WTO, they're willing to do things that they wouldn't have contemplated previously. And so I think we'll have to see what that actually means in terms of where they end up. But when it comes to topics, say, like the challenges of the Chinese state-driven economic system and state-owned enterprises, the Trump administration did some work with allies. It did work with the European Union and Japan and this trilateral initiative to kind of think about potential new rules in those areas. Well, is that still a way forward? The European Union especially has, in Japan too, has defensive equity interests, right, on some of those areas. We do as well in terms of subsidies in the United States. So can these countries get together first and then come up with a common position to then figure out how to use a rules-based approach to deal with some of the challenges that might be presented by China? Is there the potential for movement there? On completely different areas that we don't traditionally touch on in WTO circles, but we're going to have to start to think about working with allies, is in the area of export controls. What's been happening over the last year and a half or so with respect to Huawei and semiconductors and equipment and all kinds of technologies is no longer in the realm of small one-off things. These are big parts of economic activity in countries like the United States, Japan, South Korea, and the EU. But so far, all of the action has been done unilaterally by the United States. A lot of these countries don't have or haven't had historically great export control capacity, but they've shown willingness to start to move in that direction. So is that another area where there might be the ability to work more closely together? On US-China in particular, we have the Phase 1 agreement. There are elements in there that are quite good. Some of the progress on opening up China's financial services sector, some of the elements of the non-tariff barriers that were addressed in agriculture in particular are important. Opening up markets, perhaps some of the improved protections on intellectual property. These are steps in the right direction. But then when it comes to the headlines, right, the purchase commitments in the Phase 1 agreement, China's not getting close to them this year, and yet they're kind of a political nightmare for everyone else out there in the world that doesn't recognize that and that thinks that all the United States cares about is the bilateral trade deficit. And if China were just willing to buy more stuff from us and less from Europe or Brazil or whomever, we would be content with that. So what is the Biden administration going to do when it comes to things like even the basics of the Phase 1 agreement that they inherit with China? Then when it comes to the WTO, obviously, there's a lot of irritants that the Biden folks are going to inherit. The steel and aluminum tariffs are sort of tied up in that. And again, this is not as if steel in particular is a sector that's for which protection in the United States is odd, right? This is something that almost every administration ends up doing in one form or another. But the big question was, why did the Trump administration do it in the way that they did? Why did they use the national security rationale? And that seems to have added an additional layer of complexity and gravitas for especially NATO allies, right? That don't like being accused of being a threat to America's national security. So how do you resolve that issue? I would argue that it's not a one-off. It's not an easy thing to solve, and it's probably not solvable unless you also tackle it in the context of dispute settlement. Which, I raise these issues not because they're necessarily aspirational priorities of a Biden administration, but these are things that are very, very important to some of our allies. And working with allies, if it's critical for them, we're going to have to engage on some of the topics that are important for them. And for the Europeans in particular, getting a functioning dispute settlement system is critical, right? Well, how are we going to deal with that? It's not, the American concern long preceding the Trump administration was these appellate body decisions on trade remedies, anti-dumping, countervailing duties, safeguards, many of which tie back to steel decisions, right? And offering protection to steel in various ways that's politically important in the United States. So how do you deal with all of these things, right? Not as one-offs, but recognizing that they're interlinked and having a strategy to kind of figure out with allies how to tackle them jointly, right? And then we are at the same time living in this surreal world with allies where in some respects dispute settlement is defunct, and yet in other areas like the Boeing Airbus arbitration decisions, we're somehow treating that as binding, and whether or not we can negotiate a resolution to that within the confines of the arbitration awards that the arbitrators set out in those cases. So we're in this very strange world, and I think this argues for having some sort of resolution to what basic WTO dispute settlement looks like to help us get rid of a lot of this uncertainty that we have, even just in kind of dealing with allies. Okay, so that's not everything, but that's a big, sort of portfolio of items that need to be cleaned up before you can kind of go on to the really important and aspirational issues. And I think that the two that I would conclude with, and I think that are important, and again, some of this is coming out of especially what our friends in Europe and their priorities are, but it seems like are going to be priorities for the Biden administration as well, are climate. Right, and so the Europeans have been holding off on their Green New Deal and operationalizing certain elements of it. I think concerned about what a Trump administration's reaction would be if they did something like border carbon adjustment taxes. A Biden administration may not want to have to deal with that immediately. It might. Climate is obviously a priority given the nomination of Senator Secretary Kerry as the envoy. But how quickly is the United States, the public, the Congress going to be up for potentially implementing legislation which might have our own ways of doing something similar? We're going to need to engage on that quickly, the issue of climate and as it relates to trade. And then finally, the last one, and I think a really, really important one we can't overlook, is COVID and the pandemic. We're now at the stage of vaccines. As somebody who didn't know anything about this industry before obviously the pandemic hit, one thing that I've come to learn is just how special vaccines are. They can't be manufactured everywhere in the world. They can't be manufactured in a lot of places in Latin America and sub-Saharan Africa. But we need to vaccinate the world to get everybody healthy, to put an end to the pandemic. The only way we're going to do that is through trade. There is going to be a massively critical role that trade is going to play in this, whether it's trade facilitation, and it unfortunately just can't be kind of trips and compulsory licensing to poor countries, despite best intentions, given the mechanics of how the science and manufacturing here works. So there, I think I'll just conclude by saying I think that's an opportunity for a Biden administration, quick win to engage in the world on that kind of issue in ways that we haven't seen really taking place so far during the pandemic. With that, I'll conclude. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Chad. Turn it to Rob next.
Okay, so thanks very much, Josh and Nina, for this occasion. I want to begin with something that President-elect Biden himself has said recently, but also repeatedly and clearly, which is that trade is really an instrumentality to some extent of domestic policy, economic policy, and to some extent an instrumentality or a part of foreign policy. So if we're dealing with the question that Chad calls aspirational or perhaps medium or long term, we have to start, it seems to me, from that basic premise, which is not by any means a meaningless statement, because what it does mean is that we can't expect, nor ought we to expect, any kind of decisive articulation of a longer term trade agenda until the administration establishes priorities and strategies for domestic policy, including strategic industrial policy, which Mr. Biden is rightly interested in developing in the United States, and similarly for foreign policy. So, and I might have things to say that could contribute to that, question. But in terms of international trade law, all I would say is that going the route of the trilateral initiative to which Chad alluded on subsidies and certain other kinds of practices of industrial policy, which would involve probably more constraining multilateral rules, seems completely at odds with the Biden approach of unleashing industrial policy rather than tying it up. That said, I think I'd like to pass to some of the immediate challenges which have a legal dimension to them, and others on the panel who are more into economic policy might focus more on that side of it. As far as international trade law goes, as Chad says, the dispute settlement system of the WTO has essentially become non-functional. Why? Because the appellate body is a crucial link or building block of that system, and it's being made dysfunctional, as we know, by a peccadillo of the Trump administration and its USTR, which is the notion that a variety of complaints or grievances about how the appellate body has decided cases, and I would say a subtext here also is the way in which the Secretariat, as it was led for quite a few years, tilted perhaps the appellate body to deciding cases. But the way to address that is to destroy the appellate body and hope that magically some new solution comes forward, some new approach to dispute settlement, or perhaps for Lighthizer, it was more nostalgia that by destroying the existing system, one would simply almost through a kind of natural historical regression, go back to the days of the GATT, which for I think some are kind of idyllic as far as dispute settlement for trade is concerned. Well, the fact is that there's an easy opportunity to get rid of this peccadillo and simply for the incoming administration to signal that it is open to restarting the appellate body appointment process, which is not the same thing as saying we want the same people back making the same kind of decisions as the ones that were the subject of these grievances, or indeed the same people in the appellate body secretariat, or even the same role for the secretariat. I think you can start the appointments process and then have, as would in any case occur, a negotiation or deliberation between WTO members to find a group of new appellate body members who are acceptable in terms of diversity, in terms of judicial philosophy and approach. And I've suggested sometimes that the so-called Walker principles, which were aimed at finding a consensus that could move the Trump administration, obviously didn't do that, would be not a bad basis for members moving forward now with the process of discussing, what kind of judges they want on the appellate body, and how to move forward with a process that can produce a consensus on a new set of appellate body members, and maybe reforming or altering the structure or role of the appellate body secretariat, which can be done, fortunately, without changing the dispute settlement understanding. I don't really think that any new areas of negotiation are going to move forward at the WTO unless there's a functioning dispute settlement system. I mean, who would really sign on to binding commitments and make concessions without some understanding of how they're going to be enforced going forward into the future? And we now have this kind of chaotic situation of things like appeals in the void. The EU and some other countries try to create an appellate body placebo, the MPIA. Nobody knows how it will really work. In any case, it can't really lead to, as a matter of international law, enforceable decisions, even though the parties want to try and do that among themselves, the parties to that mechanism. So this, it seems to me, is fairly easy because it's really just undoing something that was a very a peculiar trait of one administration, which is, again, not to say that the issues about what kind of judges you want and how you want them to decide aren't real issues that will need to be addressed as a new appointments process moves forward. On climate, it seems to me that there may be an opportunity for the Biden administration. One of the difficult challenges the administration faces, is, at least in the short term, is what can be done on climate without Congress. And while I hesitate, to present, I'm not an expert, in fact, on U.S. On separation of powers doctrine under the U.S. Constitution. From what I understand, and certainly from the way in which the Trump administration has used presidential power over national security and foreign policy, it does seem to me that integrating a European border adjustment scheme, carbon border adjustment scheme, with U.S. Trade policy might be something that could be done without Congress, and one would achieve, even to some extent, domestic carbon, objectives by coordinating as a matter of foreign policy and national security, because as Jake Sullivan recently tweeted, climate policy is a matter of national security, by coordinating a set of US carbon penalties with EU penalties or adjustments. So that's a possibility, subject to more expert views of those who know the nuances of separation of powers doctrine better than I do. On China, and I'm kind of a China hawk, but I'm not as such that dissatisfied with what I think is the emerging approach of the Biden transition, which is a disaggregated approach to look at individual issues and transactions, examine them from a number of points of view: human rights point of view, security point of view, competitiveness, and economic strategy point of view, and make decisions based on the merits and based on expert informed interagency deliberations. And so, I mean, maybe at some point there will become a time where the administration is really pushed to the wall by China, and that might be about further suppression in Hong Kong. It might be some other issue where much harder decisions have to be taken about what we need to do about the U.S.-China conflict. But uh, but uh, but Mr. Biden, I think, has, in a way, posed a very good challenge to those of us like myself who might be consider ourselves something of China hawks, which is, if the U.S. Part of the problem, maybe the U.S. is a declining power dealing with a rising power. So, you say take a hard line. Are we equipped to take a hard line? So maybe before we start thinking in terms of a grand strategy that emphasizes conflict and confrontation, we kind of need to become stronger. First of all, through rebuilding relationships with our allies, something that Chad mentioned, but also through reindustrializing America and using industrial strategy to make America a great industrial powerhouse again, and maybe then we can, if necessary, confront China. So I think that this concern about relative power and a confrontational strategy takes the debate to another level. But looking at the short, to medium term, it seems to me that the best one can do really is to be pragmatic and hope that agencies that have more of a concern with foreign and security policy than trade and globalization will have a sufficiently great say in the way in which we deal with China on particular issues and transactions. I think my time is almost up. Is there anybody keeping track of it?
You can sure you can certainly continue, Rob. We are moving through the panelists, so maybe you could maybe conclude your remarks when you get a chance.
Another rapidly approaching issue, and this is not unconnected to China, national security, human rights, is that apparently the incoming Deputy Secretary of Treasury has stated that there's going to be a comprehensive review of U.S. sanctions within the Treasury Department. Now, many of these sanctions are not trade in the narrow, old-fashioned sense, but have to do with financial institutions, and even some are targeted at individuals as well. But there has been a kind of explosion of sanctions, and I say this as someone who does believe that sanctions can sometimes play a useful role and a laudable role in foreign policy. And one of the first moves, it seems to me, it's becoming very clear given the pronouncements of an administration nominees in the last week or two, as well as things that the president-elect himself has said, is returning to the JCPOA, the Iran deal. There seems to be already a decision within the emerging administration, the president-elect and its foreign policy team to do that. And so key there for the United States will be removing the sanctions that President Trump reimposed when he decided to repudiate the US's commitments under the Iran deal. And so if you've been following it for the last few days, there's been some indirect diplomacy with the Iranian government, different politicians making clear that on this one issue, returning to the JCPOA and Iran complying, if the US complies, there's a fair amount of consensus within Iran, so that if the Biden administration moves forward with that fairly rapidly, they could count on Iran to follow suit. So maybe that's the last issue that I want to raise, and I look forward to the questions and discussions.
Thank you, Rob. Stephen, I turn to you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thanks for having me. I'm really appreciate the opportunity to be here and talk about these issues. I think what I would like to do is sort of suggest that we all start with a more practical question, which is, what do we want as a country? I mean, when we do tax policy, or when we do foreign policy, or when we do lots of other policy areas, we tend to start by thinking, what are our goals for Americans? What kind of a country do we want to have? What sort of jobs do we want people to have? And then we go from there. When we get to trade policy, we have a tendency to kind of start at a much higher level, and I think we tend to lose track of sort of how these policy issues are going to affect Americans. So I'm going to begin with the premise that what I think most of the people watching this webinar want is a system, an economic system and a political system, much like the one that most of us have lived with for most of our lives. In other words, most people, I think, in America, and most people watching this webinar generally think that the American method of capitalism, where you encourage entrepreneurs to take risk, you leave a lot of decisions to the private sector, you have relatively low taxes and low regulations compared to the rest of the world. I think a lot of people in this country believe that's a great system, and it's worked for a very, very long time, and it makes us unique in many ways. And we would like to preserve that system, and we would like to preserve a strong middle class, which we've been fortunate enough to have for a very long time. And we would like to preserve the idea that in America, you can move forward through your own effort. In other words, you can, wherever you are, wherever you start with, if you start in a small town, or if your parents didn't go to college or whatever, by hard work and determination, you can move up in the world. And I think those are kind of the basic frameworks. And then, of course, we have our political rights, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, all those things that we've all cherished for a long time. Now, that basic model, small government, relatively small government capitalism, I think is quite popular in the United States. And in my lifetime, I think almost every presidential candidate of both parties has generally supported that model. In the late 80s and throughout the 90s, there was a real belief that this model had basically prevailed, and that the whole world was trending in our direction. And that's where I think you saw a lot of the optimism around the creation of organizations like the WTO and the original NAFTA agreement. Over the last 20 years, however, I think it's been obvious that this model faces three very major challenges. One challenge is obviously the rise of China. They believe that they have a model that works a lot better than ours. They're offering it to the world as an alternative model. They're now being pretty open about how they think that our model is past its due date, and their way is the way of the future. Then we have, obviously, our friends in Europe have a different system than we do. It's a system that involves stronger taxes, higher taxes, more regulation, much more of a technocratic government role in the economy, more willingness to use subsidies for companies like Airbus, more willingness to have the government play a big role in things like, say, tech regulation, which is an area that we and they are having some conversations about right now. And certainly they have been much more successful than we have at taking their ideas and turning them into international norms and international standards, so that if you look at the WTO, or if you look at any other sort of international body, it's more likely to take a European approach than an American approach. But the biggest threat to our system and to the system that we've had is actually not in China, it's not in the EU, it's here in the United States. And it's behind the idea that Americans will give up on this system, and we'll decide that it doesn't work, and it doesn't benefit the average person, and the whole system is rigged, and it's controlled by a cabal of people who don't have the interest of the average American at heart. And that's where you get, sort of this very, very angry movement of populists on the right, and also sort of very radical notions of socialism or some other type of economic approach on the left. And all three of these factors, the rise of China, rise of European technocracy, opposition to mainstream capitalism here in the United States, all of that flourished and grew between 2000 and 2016. when we had a globalized trading system that included China. China got more and more powerful. EU officials were able to exercise more and more influence over the US through the WTO and other factors. And you had more and more anger and frustration toward the US system at home. And that sort of roiling anger and frustration dominated American politics in 2016. It was obviously a major factor again in 2020. And to me, it's the biggest challenge facing US policymakers. If we do not solve this problem, if we are not able to convince Americans that these systems work and are beneficial, they will change them. America has had a lot of different economic systems. We've had very high taxes at different times in our past. We've had much stricter regulations than we have now. We've had protectionism, as Chad can tell you, like real protectionism, Smoot-Hawley type protectionism was a big part of our history from the 1870s to the 1920s. So if the American people do not believe that we have a trading system and we have a trade policy that benefits middle-class people and leads to improvements for middle-class life, they will change it. They will find a way to change it. It doesn't matter what frameworks you've put in place. It doesn't matter what rules you put in place. They will march, they will protest, they will elect angrier and angrier candidates until they get it changed. Now, to me, what the Trump administration was trying to do was to make what I think, viewed in context, were relatively, important, but they were making important changes to the trading system, but changes that did not significantly interfere with markets as a whole. In other words, if you look at for all the talk about what happened to the global trading system, from 2016 to 2019, US exports went up, US imports went up, the trade balance stayed about the same, but there were other things that were happening. From 2000 to 2016, real median household incomes stayed flat. They were $62,000 in 2000, $62,000 in 2016. By 2019, they were up to $68,000. Unemployment went to record lows, and not just unemployment among wealthy people, unemployment among minority groups, unemployment among women, unemployment across the board was at record low levels. And as these low levels of employment took place, workers were able to get better wages, and that's what contributed to that increase in median income. We did not have inflation. There were concerns that if you interfere with the trading system, you're going to have major inflation. That did not happen. Inflation remained very low. There were concerns we would chase away foreign direct investment. That did not happen. The stock market boomed and hit all-time highs throughout the period from 2016 to 2019. There were concerns that other countries wouldn't work with us. That did not happen. We signed trade deals with Mexico and Canada and Japan and Korea and China, all of which were genuinely popular. The one that came up to a vote in the Congress obviously passed by a huge, overwhelming margin. So that even China came to the table, and I agree with Chad. I don't think the most important part of that deal was the purchases. I think the most important of that deal were the structural changes, and I agree with Chad. They were stronger than anything we'd gotten from China before. So coming into 2020, you had a significant increase in real median incomes. You had record low unemployment. You had no inflation. You had a brand new USMCA that had passed overwhelmingly. You had a new phase one trade deal that had passed with China. And I think you could see a lot of those voters who had been angry and frustrated back in 2015, 2016, now they were starting to come around, right? Their members had supported the USMCA. That had passed with a huge vote. Nina pointed out that support for trade was going up. You were starting to see this kind of anger toward the system recede. Now, obviously, we've had a year of pandemic. That's had a lot of effect on a lot of different people. I would point out that this will still be the third year in a row. 2020 will be the third year in a row in which the U.S. economy, in terms of its GDP growth, is the strongest economy in the G7. We had the strongest economy in 18. We had the strongest economy in 19. We're going to have the strongest economy in 20. So I think these policies were working. I think that they were on the way to rebuilding trust in the system and helping us get to a point where we could really stand up and protect this system that a lot of us like and want to maintain. I hope the Biden administration will learn from the events of the last 4 years. I think I'm encouraged by some of the things I'm hearing. I think they are going to be fairly cautious in how they approach some of these issues. And I think if you look at where the U.S. economy was in 2019, that is a really good place, and it's a place I hope we can soon get back to.
Thanks, Stephen. Turn last but not least to David.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to join this panel, really distinguished group, a great topic. A lot of good points have already been made. Let me introduce 3 thoughts, a little bit of repetition from others, but I'll try to keep that to a minimum. So first point is that I think it's in the US interest to get back into new trade agreements and to play a role in global rulemaking. It's understandable that the Biden team will spend the first 6 months focusing on getting the pandemic under control and relief for the economy, trying to get back onto a decent growth trajectory. So that's understandable. But as naturally the administration turns to a broader agenda later in 2021, I would encourage them to include trade as part of that. And that does not necessarily mean the big headline agreements that people talk about, the Trans-Pacific Partnership or TPP or TTIP with the Europeans. There are other ways that we could be pursuing trade agreements. One interesting idea, particularly in order to avoid some confrontation with Congress, we might go to the TPP members and try to negotiate a digital trade agreement with those groups. Essentially, we'd already done that. Shouldn't be too difficult to actually have a digital trade agreement among the TPP 11 plus the US, which would be very significant. In the case of Europe, there are a lot of specific issues before we get around to any big mega agreement. The Europeans care a lot about the functioning of the WTO. They want to see the dispute resolution working. They're unhappy that the US has applied tariffs that violate the WTO. We have quite different approach to data than the Europeans. So it's a challenge, but I think we should try to negotiate a common position with the Europeans on data privacy and cross-border data flows. They want to tax our big tech companies. So we have a lot of issues. To me, Chad started us off by talking about the mantra of we want to work with allies, which makes sense. Europe is obviously a key group of allies, but then what are we going to work with them on? And I think if work with allies means that we want European countries to fall in line with our positions on a lot of trade issues, that is not going to happen. The world has changed and European countries have strong opinions on many of these. So an important question is, will this US administration be willing to compromise in order to reach agreement with allies? Same thing with the Asian allies. Japan, of course, will want the US to come back into TPP before too long. Are we willing to take that seriously? Or does working with allies mean that we're going to communicate, but we expect everyone to fall in line? So I think that's up in the air how that's going to work. But my first point is it's very much in the US interest to get back into trade agreements and rulemaking, partly because this will be good for the US economy, but frankly, we're a big self-sufficient economy. To me, it's more of a foreign policy issue of maintaining a global order in which all our medium-sized partners can thrive. Now, the second point I want to make is it's hard to be optimistic about my first point because of US domestic politics. I think the whole issue of trade is controversial within the Democratic Party. And now, in fact, I think we can say that both parties have pretty strong protectionist streaks within them. And what's ironic is that opinion surveys show broad support for free trade and more support among registered Democrats than among registered Republicans. Particularly college-educated Democrats are overwhelmingly in favor of trade. But you've got some specific interest groups within the Democratic Party who are opposed to trade agreements. And I worry that the Biden administration may not want to take on those interest groups, even though the way the world is evolving, this should be less of an issue, less of a domestic political issue. Some people point to the bipartisan support for the MCA as a model. I don't particularly like the MCA. I think we introduced some serious protectionism in the auto sector that's not going to work out well, and it would be very hard to negotiate with other partners. So I don't see that as any kind of easy model. And what I really worry about, I take up Stephen's point that, you know, Americans are very concerned about what's perceived as the decline of the middle class and the disappearance of good jobs. Trade protectionism is not going to bring back manufacturing jobs or create good jobs. The issue, I think, is real, and it takes, you know, a serious mix of policies, significant investment in infrastructure. I'm in favor of a higher minimum wage. I think family-friendly policies would make a big difference. Some reform of our tax code, which still benefits companies that move overseas rather than producing at home. So I think there's a big agenda of addressing inequality in the United States. It's going to be hard to move on in this polarized political environment. And if the substitute for a serious program like that is protectionism to try to create a few jobs, you know, that I think we've tried that the last few years. We lost manufacturing jobs because of the protection we aimed against China. And there's no reason to think that protectionist approach is going to be bringing back good jobs to the US. Last point I want to make is about US-China relations. I've been involved in quite a few dialogues, conferences, you know, Zoom meetings with Chinese technocrats and Chinese researchers since the election. And it's hard to be optimistic about US-China economic relations. What I hear from a lot of Chinese counterparts is the sense that President Trump created these difficulties and the US has to undo them before there's any real negotiation with China. And I think that's just a non-starter. China needs to take responsibility for the difficult situation that we're in terms of our economic relations. But I, in fact, do not see that happening. As Chad said, the phase one trade deal is not working out very well. Biden has made it clear he's not going to remove these tariffs aimed at China anytime soon. Probably you won't get much movement in the first year, and it's hard to predict further out, but it's quite possible that we'll just have this stagnating economic relationship going forward. Now, China is hedging. They've reached this agreement with ASEAN, Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, the RCEP agreement, which is not terribly deep, but it is some significant trade liberalization, will tend to solidify value chains in that group of Asia-Pacific economies. And then it was surprising that President Xi Jinping raised the prospect of joining CPTPP in a recent speech. I think this is a little bit of just posturing. It would be a really smart move for China because that agreement would actually address a lot of the domestic issues that they need to address. Things like intellectual property rights protection, opening all sectors of the economy to direct investment, disciplines for state enterprises. So it'd be a very shrewd move on the part of China to join the TPP, but they have their own domestic politics as well. And I worry that neither the US nor China is really going to be taking the lead in new, deep trade agreements that deal with the modern issues, the 21st century issues. So I'm afraid it's hard to be optimistic. I do think trade agenda should be an important part of US foreign policy and domestic economic policy. For it to work well for Americans, it would have to be complemented by a lot more support and programs that would be affecting inequality and helping the working class and the middle class. And it's hard to see that happening in our politics. And it's difficult to see US-China relations improving very much. So I think it's clear what needs to be done. it's hard to be optimistic that we're actually going to get much progress over the next few years. I'll stop there and look forward to the discussion with the rest of the colleagues.
Great. Thanks, David. And thanks all the panelists for what was actually a very rich and varied set of presentations, which I think gives us a lot to work on. Can you hear me? Yep, great. Okay. Yeah, I think we've got a lot to work with. And so let's just dive right into it. What I want to pick up on is, I think, a theme which came through with most of the presentations, which is sort of around, Rob, your point about trade as being instrumental, and to some extent it's a sequencing issue around, there's a priority naturally of the Biden administration to focus on righting the economic ship and getting domestic policy right. And then what role does trade policy play in that context, right, in support of some of the objectives that Stephen outlined, supporting middle-class jobs, wages, building a stronger sort of manufacturing base. So I just want to put that out to you in terms of, this is probably more of an economic policy issue really than it is a trade law issue, but there's a trade law angle as well here, Rob, because you made the point about the trilateral discussion potentially tying the Biden administration's hands unnecessarily if you do want to have a robust strategy domestically. So there's two parts to this question. One is, how should we be thinking about trade policy and sequencing it with domestic policy in order to achieve, I think, some of the high-level goals that Stephen outlined, and what does that look like? And then the other part of it is, from a trade sort of policy or trade law perspective, there are two sort of approaches here, right? The trilateral discussion was really focused around a new set of rules that would tie China's hands. And Rob, you raised concern about it tying the United States' hands. I'd like you just to outline particularly what your areas of concern might be there. And also when you address that, and this is also open to anyone on the panel, how effective would a new set of rules anyway be in addressing the challenges we face in China? Is a more detailed approach through rules going to do the job when it comes to the types of outcomes that we would like from China on issues like subsidies and state-owned enterprises as well? So let me just open it up to anyone who wants to jump into those questions. Chad?
So I think that's great and really important on the subsidies. So I think, one of the things that I think it's important to note about kind of the trilateral process, and at least some of my own thoughts on industrial subsidies, it's not just disciplining subsidies, it's also potentially being explicit about what green boxes would be, right? And I think the problem is what some of the concerns might be right now is countries aren't willing to subsidize things because they're worried about them being countervailed, right? So I think, we look at, so take climate and green emphasis, right? China massively subsidized the world production of solar panels, right? Which probably has a net benefit for climate. And yet the United States, Europe, we went after them with trade remedies, right? It's an incoherent global approach. And so I think establishing, not just disciplines, but carve outs for where we think, the appropriate subsidy should be, I think is one way to go. The second is sort of another example there, but it's in a different space, is if you've been tracking what's been going on with the NDAA on semiconductors, right? There's sort of recognition that, well, with all these export controls, it looks like the American semiconductor industry is basically going to be cut off from China as a revenue source. And, they need to have some way of dealing with that. And so they proposed, kind of subsidies, maybe industrial policy for the semiconductor industry, but thinking about doing so in a broader sense, not a national sense, but doing it with like-minded countries when they can define who those are. It's proposals like, if you're willing to sign up to the same sort of export controls, the same worries about nefarious players as we are, then we can do kind of common subsidization of, the foundational elements of this, the R&D, the pre-competitive stuff that I think most folks would be on board with. So I think there are kind of creative ways of thinking about some of these subsidies areas. that wouldn't just be thou shalt not subsidize, right? It's actually being a little bit clearer, and then you don't have to worry as much, I would hope, about disputes, countervail, and those kinds of issues trickling in that might discourage the subsidies that you want to see actually happening from materializing in practice.
I have a couple of thoughts. First of all, to echo what Chad said, that there is, I mean, in theory, one could want more clearly defined policy space in the than we have under the existing rules. And so if there were an objective to a negotiating objective on subsidies, I think that it would be driven by U.S. Industrial strategy and aimed at ensuring, that the policies that are determined to be optimal or at least experimentally desirable would not be so vulnerable as they might be now to challenge. And so that could be a good thing. The criticism that I made of the trilateral approach was that, at least in our declarations that initially articulated it in public, the focus appeared to be on more constraints rather than more policy space. But as Chad says, that's not an inevitable focus of reform. On subsidizing renewable or green energy, it seems to me one of the big issues there is, at the same time as doing so, the US and the EU have also been continuing enormous subsidies to fossil fuels. So subsidies are not only part of the solution in some way, they're also part of the problem. And I believe a respectable economic institution or think tank actually estimated that the green energy subsidies in the EU, in their impact on carbon emissions, were entirely canceled out by its fossil fuel subsidies. So the EU taxpayer was paying twice, essentially, for nothing, for a wash. And so the Biden administration, or in the campaign, the Biden campaign did say that they want to do something about fossil fuel subsidies. And they're also, along the lines perhaps of the agreement on agriculture, one could imagine a multilateral approach to phasing them out, or having a green box to deal with issues about access to energy for low-income consumers, and so on. I mean, that would be, an area where, as a matter of rationality, as opposed to interest group politics, one would imagine a consensus, because there's a global public good that's created when we get rid of these subsidies, because they reduce the price distortion that actually leads to greater carbon emissions, and not by a trivial amount. I mean, the IMF has estimated these, and there's a significant gain to be had by removing these subsidies. The final point is, in terms of how much of the U.S. industrial strategy from the get-go emphasizes subsidies, here again you have the problem of the Congress. And so it may be that initially many of the instruments will have to be creative ones that don't necessarily demand significant, transparent, on-budget expenditures that would require a congressional approval. And there, procurement might be one area to explore. And I would just mention briefly, obviously, as everyone knows, the GPA, the WTO Government Procurement Agreement, is a plurilateral agreement. And one of the features of this agreement is that any member can alter its coverage and its commitments. It can adjust commitments subject to some negotiation or compensatory mechanism or reciprocity with others. But the fact is that this may be necessary to think about that. The Trump administration sent a notice the other day to the WTO GPA committee that it was limiting the U.S.'s coverage in respect of certain medicines that were that they listed, but one could do that for any other area where Buy American in government procurement is being undertaken for industrial policy or industrial strategy purposes.
Well, listen, I think one of the things that you're sort of hearing everybody on the panel wrestle with is it's very, very difficult to make policy and make international rules and help other countries all at the same time, okay? In other words, it seems to me we have to sort of set our priorities. And I think we have to start with what David introduced. What is the purpose of U.S. trade policy? Is it primarily to benefit Americans and American workers, or is it primarily a tool of foreign policy designed to help our allies, right? Because if you want to help the allies, that's not the same as saying you want higher wages in Detroit. Those are like two different goals, right? So you have to sort of prioritize there. Then once you've made that priority, you have to say, okay, you go back to the questions that Rob and Chad are raising. What are the actual policies that are going to work? Let's not talk about the rules yet. What will actually accomplish the goals that we want? Do we want to have an industrial policy? Do we want to have a Buy America program? Do we want to have, whatever it is that we want to have? And let's work that out as a policy. Only then does it make any sense to kind of talk about sitting down with other countries and making rules. Until we know what we want, then it doesn't make sense to say, okay, let's build a whole rule system around that. But what's happened is that the rules-based system over time has constrained U.S. thinking so much that we're only able to think inside these little tiny boxes, like the government procurement agreement or, whatever the appellate body is going to say about this or that provision of the SCM agreement. And because of that, all of our policy thought is just being truncated and weakened, right? We don't make tax policy this way. We don't make foreign policy this way. And we shouldn't make trade policy this way. So that's what I would really suggest. Let's first of all figure out what's the overall goal here, helping ourselves or helping others. And then second of all, what's the best policy? And then worry about rules. We need flexibility. That's one of the things that's really hurting us.
I want to just, before we go on, just quickly mention to the rest of the audience out there that once this moderated conversation is over, we are going to open it up for Q&A for the panelists. Nina did mention it's at the beginning. So if you do want to ask questions of the panels, please email the address that Nina read out before. And I think it's in that we can put in the chat function as well for you to see it so that we can sort of we can work out how we get those questions to the panels. So you've got some time to think through that, but I just want to flag that again. Nina, if you want to ask a question.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, it's hashtag AskAEIEcon or john.kearns at aei.org. So please do send in your questions. So yes, thank you to the panelists and for responding on those first series of questions. I want to sort of step back here and pick up actually on something that Stephen talked about thinking through, what do we want as a country in terms of our trade policy, and then how do we go forward? I guess the question is that even when we make those policy choices as a country, those choices are also not happening in a vacuum, whether it's on trade or any of the other policy areas. So if we make a decision on tax policy or trade policy or other types of policy, if we don't have an agreement or a set of rules globally about how those policies will operate, there would also be those reactions in our trading partners with other countries, which could have externalities for the United States. So I guess where I'm going with this is when I'm thinking about the future of the WTO and the world trading system, taken from that lens about, because I think Stephen again has asked a really important question about what do we want as a country. What do we really see as the future of this organization? I wonder about the credibility of the organization in terms of how it's been able to just withstand or not withstand the trading practices of China and various other institutions. As I noted in the introduction, we haven't had real trade negotiations here. And we're talking about some of the sort of the more limited issues that we may be able to see progress, whether it's on subsidies or, plurilateral agreements or the like. But, maybe we could sort of step back as a group and ask the question, what does this organization need to look like going forward where it satisfies the U.S.'s ability for us to have a trade policy that benefits the U.S., but at the same time requires our trading partners to also live up to those commitments, whereby those rules actually mean something.
Well, let me be the person who defends the WTO a little bit, okay? I mean, if you look back at a long history, we have had a remarkable period of prosperity, and it predates the WTO, goes back to the GATT period to some extent. I do think the WTO has been able to adjudicate some important disputes and get buy-in from all the major players. And we hear lots of complaints about China, and I make them as well. But remember, we're all negotiating with China, right? So Australia, despite their difficulties with China, Japan, despite various issues, they're negotiating with China to be part of this RCEP agreement. We have this phase 1 agreement with China, which many of us are not enthusiastic about, but obviously we thought we could negotiate with them. Europe is negotiating with them. So the revealed preference of all of these advanced economies is that they think agreements with China actually do mean something, and that to some extent they discipline Chinese behavior, and they lead to arm's length transactions that are beneficial for both sides. So we certainly can improve on all of this, but I think sometimes the discussion seems to me just takes for granted the progress that we've made and doesn't recognize how important this is to our prosperity.
Yeah,
I'd like to build.
I'm sorry, Rob. Let me just say, I just want to level set on that a little bit. I mean, China joined the WTO in 2000, and after China had been in the WTO for 16 years, our real median income was exactly the same as it had been in 2000. It's pretty hard to find a 16-year period in American history where we didn't have any increase in real median income at all. So I think that was pretty much a disaster. Also, when China joined the WTO, we were obviously by and large the greatest economic power in the world. Now, I think most people in Washington think that within 10 years, China is going to be a bigger and greater economic power than we are. So I think it's kind of hard to see how it could have possibly gone much worse than it is. So I think the idea that our prosperity or success depends on the WTO, or that the WTO has significantly contributed to that prosperity or success, the facts just do not bear it out. My advice would be that going forward, we treat the WTO much like we treat the United Nations. It's there, we're a part of it, we want to use it as best we can. It's a nice forum to talk to our other countries. As David pointed out, there are areas where we can work together with other people, and certainly we're not going to withdraw, and we're not going to not participate in it anymore. But nobody expects the Secretary of State or the Pentagon to do their policy based on what is and is not acceptable to the UN. And we can't say, our trade policy has to be signed off on by the WTO.
Bob, did you want to come in?
Yeah, so I kind of liked Stephen's formulation at the end, because, I think that the WTO is a very useful international organization, but what we have to get over is, excessive expectations, or what happened, let's say a decade or two ago, which was projecting onto the WTO a certain kind of neoliberal fantasy of comprehensive global economic governance, once we understand what the WTO can and can't do, it does a lot of useful things. And it's not an expensive international organization either. I mean, I would not compare it to the UN, where I believe we're throwing away huge amounts of money on a very ineffective bureaucracy. We could get, if we were to just take a portion of what we pay for the UN and invest it in improving, the resources of the WTO, we could get much better results for governance. The WTO is a relatively small, relatively well-run organization of professionals and delegates with a certain level of commitment to following the issues and presenting the points of view of their countries in a responsible and transparent, often, I hope, way. And as we saw with COVID, just as we saw with the 2007 or 2008, 2011 financial crisis, it provides a forum for confidence building, information exchange that can often, through a combination of peer pressure and better, and better understanding of what different countries are doing, reduce pressures for beggar thy neighbor responses to very real kinds of crises. And those like Pascal Lamy, who criticized the consensus-based system as medieval or whatever, the fact is that the WTO can respond to emergencies in a constructive way. And I think, as we've seen with the pandemic, that makes it a vital organization, thinking of it primarily in terms of making these rules that are always going to be legally binding rules, is a much too limited way of looking at the WTO and its role in global economic governance. The other point that addressing Nina particularly, I thought your provocation, if I could call it that, was very helpful to moving the discussion forward. So I'm glad we have it on the table. Is that, since the GATT became the WTO, and the WTO came to its current, to this current moment, a lot has happened with the structure of the global political economy. But a lot of it is on the about finance and investment, and without understanding the significance of investment flows and capital flows more generally for questions such as what are often referred to as imbalances, and less, I think, precisely or less usefully as trade deficits, and how balanced or unbalanced is the system in favor or against certain of the players, including the United States. To understand these problems, we have to delve into matters that are not really governed, except in the most general way, by the WTO, which is the kind of financial system or non-system that has emerged, as well as some of the consequences of the globalization of investment, which, as USTR Lighthizer, I think, rightly pointed out, has been, in a way, subsidized by investor-state dispute settlement that gives corporations special rights to sue governments if governments change policies in ways that disadvantage the profit or the profiteering interests or profit maximizing interests of those companies. So we have to think about that. And tax, that it's not the trade rules really, it's what's enabled multinational corporations to create structures and devices that basically result in tax avoidance on a global scale. And to come back to what we can usefully talk about with our allies and agree on, and I agree with Stephen, it's not a matter of helping them, it's a matter of our helping each other. I do think the digital tax issue is an issue where there's a win-win outcome, because we can, it's not a matter just of whether Europe or the U.S. Taxes this revenue or this economic activity. It's a question of that both should be able to tax it, and these companies are avoiding U.S. tax as well as avoiding being taxed in Europe. So we ought to have a cooperative solution and share the rents between us, and that could be a win-win solution, which will get these firms to pay their taxes and reduce all the economic distortions that come, from them not being taxpayers.
Thanks, Rob. That's comprehensive.
Can I weigh in just very quickly on the WTO? I think that there's a risk listening to this conversation of maybe two things. One, giving it too much credit of what it can possibly do, and then laying too much blame on it for things that happen as if it's somehow responsible. So I think, positively, what the WTO, when it's been, called the dispute settlement, the crown jewel, what it did is provided a framework to help resolve trade disputes that inevitably arise between countries that trade with one another, right? US, Canada, we've got this great new USMCA, boom, we already have a trade dispute over dairy, right? Well, we have a framework to deal with that. That's what we mean by saying that. The idea that the WTO somehow constrains the United States, I'm a bit flummoxed by, because I don't understand then what suddenly changed in 2016. What changed about the WTO that suddenly unshackled the United States with the Trump administration? No, the Trump administration just decided that they were going to do what they wanted to do, and for a large part ignored the WTO. Any other administration could have done the same thing. It was a choice that they made, a political choice that they made. So I really don't think that we should blame this on the WTO. And on the issue of China in the WTO, I think it's also oversimplifying. Somebody explain to me what the counterfactual would have been, right? What would China's policies have been if it hadn't been in the WTO after 2001? What would our, in the world's policy response to China have been during that same period? If we're going to talk about, before and after and make those kinds of comparisons, we really got to be a bit more precise about what that world would have looked like, but for us engaging through a WTO framework during that time period.
Thanks, Chet. There's a lot there. One of the things I just want to delve a little bit more deeply in, which is coming up in a number of these conversations around the WTO, is this notion of, well, Rob, you spoke a lot about the appellate body, but the notion of having a mechanism to actually determine what the rules mean and to make the rules mean something in terms of outcomes. The Trump administration, I don't have to run through it, but it's clearly got to a point where the appellate body no longer functions, arguably on a particular concern around the interpretation of the rules and zeroing in particular. And this is more of a trade law question. I mean, I know that there are other concerns out there, but Rob, you came out quite strongly about the need of actually re-establishing the appellate body to just underpin the functioning of the WTO, the goodwill, and also to give any sense of the ability to do anything new in the WTO. You have to have a way of actually finding a way to actually apply these new rules. There's a complex question around, you've done a lot of work, Rob, around the appellate body and the extent that it's had a very sensitive jurisprudence and actually interpreted most of the rules, maybe put the anti-dumping rules aside, but in the rest of the commitments, there's actually providing a lot of policy space to members, and arguably a lot more policy space than existed under the GATT, which had a particular teleology to it. And so there's sort of an irony about thinking about going back to a GATT period, which actually provided less policy space to members in many respects than you probably got with most of the appellate body rulings. Now, people may disagree with this, but I just want to throw that out there because, Stephen, I think you probably disagree with this. But just to sort of unpack a bit more the importance of having an appellate body mechanism for the functioning of the WTO and for the possibility of really negotiating new rules going forward seems a crucial decision. I don't know if you want to get into that a bit more, Rob or Stephen or anyone else.
Yeah, I will say a bit more about it. So first of all, I want to make clear that I'm not completely dogmatic on this. If we were to reinvent, the dispute settlement system, there's a plausible argument that a professional panel system might do as well, as a system with a first instance and appellate review. And in a recent provocative piece, Petros Mavroidis and Bernard Hookman have actually made that argument that if you have a really good panel process and the panelists are really serious judges and supported by expertise, including economic expertise, then you don't really need the appellate body. And after all, the nature of adjudication in the WTO is you're already often adjudicating decisions that have been made by quasi-judicial bodies or laws that have been determined by domestic judicial bodies. So maybe if we were reinventing it, we would say have binding decisions, yes, enforceable decisions, yes, but have a really first-rate single-tier system. But the problem there is that that involves obviously DSU reform. The predicament we're in now is we have a system where the treaty, the law presupposes the appellate body, and it's not functioning. So, do we take several years and try and create a new system through DSU reform and get consensus on that? Or do we try to simply go back to where, the Trump administration decided it was going to trash the appellate body and say, we don't want to trash the appellate body, so let's restart the appointment process. We might want more influence on who the judges are, and that was the Obama USTR was already trying to do that, albeit a little crudely, I think, and not so legitimately by punishing particular judges by stopping their reappointment. I don't think that was the way to go, but now we have a tabula rasa. We have a full slate of appellate body members to be appointed, and we can work with other members to get some understanding of the diversity of views and approaches to adjudication we want these people to have, in addition to the role of the Secretariat. I believe that if you looked at the decisions that have most offended not only the Trump administration, but the U.S. Washington Trade Bar more generally, the vast majority of them have come in probably, the last 15 years or so of appellate body jurisprudence. So that may be just a function of the fact that there are a lot more cases because the appellate body has been operating for longer and more disputes have been brought. But I do think that there is visible in the way in which the appellate body has developed over time a move to, not necessarily in substance on any particular issue like zeroing, but a move to a greater rigidity and an attempt to always state a decision in terms of some kind of massive jurisprudential edifice that they keep seeming to try and tighten. And here I see some of the reasonableness of the concerns of some people in the Trump administration. Not that we should give up on the idea of precedent or consistency in jurisprudence altogether, but this kind of tightening so that in a way that jurisprudence starts looking like a Prussian military code or something. This style needs to be addressed, and one way of addressing it is thinking about the questions we ask potential candidates for the appellate body when delegations interview them, or when members of the Secretariat interview them, and what their backgrounds are. I liked very much the diversity of backgrounds of the early appellate body, but of course we're dealing with a WTO where there are more players, China, Russia obviously being among them. So we have to think of diversity in those appointments along many different planes or frontiers. But certainly judicial style and approach are legitimate questions to be asked of candidates for appellate body positions. And especially, there's a chance to renew the appellate body Secretariat and really rethink, and I'm just repeating myself, so I should probably shut up at this point, rethink what their role is. Is it as guardians of the equivalent of a Prussian military code of jurisprudence, or is it to supply clerkship and research resources to cabinets or offices that are really directed by the individual appellate body members themselves, who, after all, are supposed to be and ought to be distinguished jurists. And I favor the latter approach if we're going to renew the appellate body secretariat, assuming we need it at all. And maybe we should just put the resources into the offices of judges having appropriate judicial clerks, and perhaps even a more senior legal officer as a clerk to the appellate body as a whole, again, as opposed to the kind of secretariat we've had over the last 20 years, which has kind of, I think, turned into an institution that almost saw itself as the guarantee of the jurisprudence. And that, again, has to do, with judges coming and going over their various terms. And you don't want a secretariat to be entrenched so that it becomes the kind of entire institutional memory of the jurisprudence. There have to be other ways of having the appropriate institutional memory that different courts and tribunals have been able to come up with, both at the regional and international level, that we might look at in restructuring the appellate body secretariat. And Joost Bown, my friend and colleague, who you all know probably because he normally spends a fair amount of time at Georgetown in DC, has, I think, written in a very important way on this issue.
Thanks, Rob. There's a lot there. Stephen, do you want to come in? You're on mute. Stephen, we can't hear
you. I think Chad put his finger on kind of the key point here, which is, are we bound by the WTO or not? I mean, I agree with Chad's point on that. In other words, if we're not bound by it, then we can pretty much do whatever we want, and the rest of the world will do whatever they want, and the appellate body will weigh in and give us advice or not give us advice. But we have to be very, very clear as Americans. The rest of the world, they do have a consensus on this. They believe we are bound. They believe we have to do what the appellate body tells us, whatever our reading of the text is. Europe believes that, China believes that. There's 160 members of the WTO who all believe that. So we can continue. We have to understand where we are. I share Rob's desire for a productive negotiation on the appellate body. I do not think there will be a productive negotiation on the appellate body. We had a negotiation in the 90s. We got a lot of protections that we thought were going to help, and they didn't help and they didn't work. And the Obama administration tried to negotiate over this, and they didn't get anywhere. The rest of the world believes very, very strongly that the appellate body should make binding rules for all members, including the United States. That's their position. We can either agree to it or not agree to it, but they're not going to change. And I think we have to be very, very realistic about that going forward. We can either have no appellate body, we can have an appellate body and we do what we're told, or we can have an appellate body and we're free to go rogue whenever we choose to go rogue. Those are the only options, and we have to just be realistic about that. Nina, I just want to bring you in. I know you've got another question to follow up. I just want to make the brief point about this notion of binding or not binding. It seems to me that we can all agree that appellate body rule is binding in a national law sense. I think it still then remains up to governments to decide what to do with it. I mean, you can still clearly choose to disobey it and face retaliation. And so countries, the Europeans, all the time choose not to comply with appellate body rules and face retaliation. The US has done that, and others. So, there seems to be another step once we agree that there's bindingness in what countries and governments decide to do with it. Nina, do you want to come in with a question?
Yeah. We've actually gotten some questions in from our audience. So let me maybe start with a first one. We've had some conversation about the 301 tariffs, and question has come in about really what may be the state of the 232 steel and aluminum tariffs, especially with Europe and Japan, and what may occur as we go forward in the broader context of the the conversation we're having here. I would add to that, I think in the context of the tariffs, it might be interesting actually to flesh out a point that Chad made right at the beginning of his presentation, which is the Biden team has made it a point to discuss that, look, we're going to focus on multilateral relationship. We're going to build our relationships with our rebuild our relationships with our allies. We've had a lot of conversations about it in the context of this discussion. But Chad, I think you posed a really interesting question, which is, the U.S. has been working with allies in the past. What are they going to be willing to do differently going forward? And I think it's tied up with some of the things that Stephen just mentioned, which is our allies may take fundamentally different views on whether it's the tariffs, the purpose of the appellate body, the rules in the WTO. So we'd just like to throw out there to the panel, what is, both in terms of the U.S. policy and the tariffs, what may that look like, but also what may that conversation with allies look like at a more granular level that may be more purposeful in moving forward U.S. interests?
Well, I'm happy to weigh in on that. I think that our European allies have very strong views on a whole range of issues. So the key question is the Biden administration going to be willing to compromise? And I think the Europeans would like to restore the dispute resolution. They're not happy about the US tariffs. I think the easy call is for Biden to get rid of the 232 tariffs against our allies, which really don't make any sense at all. I'm assuming that one's relatively easy and that will make the Europeans happy, but they have other issues. Japan is going to want us to join the Trans-Pacific Partnership. South Korea would like us to negotiate more openness with China, but they don't really want a Cold War between the United States and China. So each of these allies is going to have very specific things that they want. And it's easy to say work with allies, but then the devil will be in the details. And in particular, is the U.S. willing to make compromises? If we're not willing to make any compromises, then it's just rhetoric to say we're working with allies.
Well, I'll weigh in here just very briefly. Obviously, and Nina, you know this, I've represented various steel companies for a very long time, so people should take that into account as they hear these comments. I do think there are very, very strong reasons to believe that we have a global oversupply of steel. It's not just a China issue, it's a world issue. The OECD has done work on this, the G20 has done work on this. It's a global problem. That's the reason the president went with the type of remedy that he went with. So if you don't get that right, you will have a steel crisis, or you will risk a steel crisis. And for anyone who went through the steel crisis of 2000 and 2001, which I know a lot of you guys remember, and the Bush administration ended up having to put in safeguards. That's not something I think the Biden administration is going to want to deal with. So I think I strongly agree with the comment that our allies are going to have very, very strong views. I think they're going to have very strong preferences. I think we have very limited ability to get them to move in the direction that we want. But at the same time, I think policymakers are very constrained by the American people as well. And they are not going to be happy if we make deals that result in, job losses or declines in the median income. And so that is the challenge.
I just want to say here that, one area where I have again some degree of optimism is in climate-related policies. I mean, we've had an administration where at least the president doesn't really believe that climate change exists. I mean, this is and it seems to me Europe appreciates that this is a big difference. Also, what I sense is that while there are some issues that are going to produce a lot of division between progressives and centrists within the Democratic Party and maybe even within the administration, the fossil fuel industry is losing the centrists. And so I see the possibility of a fairly strong consensus on the urgency of climate action emerging within the administration, broadly supported by the base of Democratic voters and the relevant constituencies. And that does open up a lot of opportunities for working with Europe and other allies, for that matter, on the climate agenda, which has a lot of trade aspects or dimensions, to it. And so I just want to, to emphasize that there are areas where we just don't realize how the exceptionalism of the Trump administration has put us offside the people that we normally should be able to work with on an issue which is of global concern in the deepest sense. I mean, saving the planet from a climate catastrophe. I think we're coming out of almost like a hostage situation where, where we have an administration denying the most critical reality facing the entire planet for 4 years, and no longer denying it, but recognizing that as urgent is a game changer that will, I think, almost instantly fundamentally affect the dynamics of our relationships around the world.
Thanks. Oh.
Let me just pivot briefly now to a question about the CPTPP, because it came up. David, you mentioned that you thought it was a good idea to participate in it, and I think you said you also did not like USMCA in part because of the protectionism on the rules of origin. And actually, what I do want to ask a question of is in fact about rules of origin, one of the less sexy topics in trade policy, but potentially one of the more important ones when we think about FTAs, because one of the things that changed dramatically under USMCA compared to TPP was rules of origin on autos, right? We went from about 45% regional content value under TPP for autos to 75% plus, wage rate percentages and other conditions. So a significant tightening of that. And it seems to me that embedded in that change is a policy choice that we have to make about FTAs going forward, which is if we think about FTAs as broader platform for competitiveness, then we might want lower rules of origin. If we think about FTAs as creating leverage over China, in particular, which is certainly how the CPTPP and the TPP was being crafted and sold, then we want tighter rules of origin to minimise China's participation, because otherwise that leverage becomes significantly less. So I want to throw that open to the panel in terms of how do we think about sort of that part of an FTA strategy going forward, and how we think about building rules of origin, given that we may be having these goals which can be in tension with each other.
From my point of view, the competitiveness aspect is the most important. So I see us joining these, high standard plurilateral agreements like TPP primarily to be more competitive. As you look at some of the most advanced industries, and we have very complicated global value chains. We don't live in a world where anybody produces a whole product. The top end products generally have high value added inputs from some locations, low value added inputs from other locations. It's very efficient. And American firms trade primarily on the basis of intellectual property. Someone estimated that 85% of the stock market capitalization of the S&P 500 corresponds to intellectual property. Yeah. So think of our firms trading on the basis of intangible property. And we want the sophisticated part of the value chain to be among a group of countries with good intellectual property rights and investment openness and all the things we built in the TPP. But it can still be efficient then to be buying low-end stuff from developing countries that are not ready to sign up to these standards. So I have to say, I was very heartened that Vietnam, was one of the TPP countries. But in general, we don't have low-wage, aspiring manufacturing countries coming into these high-end agreements. So I worry if we make the content too high, we lose that potential efficiency. And then the last thing I'll say, Josh, is I also worry about the administrative costs. We're creating a really complicated world where you're going to have RCEP rules of origin and CPTPP rules of origin and MCA rules of origin. I mean, this is really getting to be a burden on firms. So I do worry about that.
Thanks, David. Anyone else want to come in on that?
Yeah, I would just say that the image of agreements like TPP or CPTPP as involving basically high-wage countries with, when you look at Malaysia, one of the worst offenders for forced or slave labor, it's part of the TPP. Very little on labor in that agreement or the version of it now in force, and it's just these are agreements for global capital on the backs of workers, and I'm really happy that the Biden administration is not going to be racing into any of them.
Yeah, I agree with Rob on all that. I mean, Secretary Clinton in 2016 said the TPP was a job killer, and that's the reason she said it, because it would simply, the immediate effect of it would have been to encourage companies to move offshore, take advantage of low wages in Vietnam and Malaysia, use the low rules of origin to bring in a lot of value from China and come tariff-free into the United States. And that's why it couldn't get through the Congress. That's why Secretary Clinton opposed it. That's why we got out of it. And my guess is we'll stay out of it.
Chad, any points on this? No? Okay.
Well, maybe we can
Nina.
shift to some, maybe we can shift to some questions that have come in from our audience. I'm going to try to package a few of these together. I think maybe in the vein of thinking about how the Biden administration and the U.S. and U.S. policy generally as we go forward can build support for trade. We have a few questions here about what the Biden administration may be able to do about increasing support for funding of programs that could support workers who lose their jobs due to global competition. So this is under U.S. law, the trade adjustment assistance type of support, retraining, and enhanced unemployment insurance. We also have another question here about what the Biden administration may be able to do to support trade policies that prioritize small and medium-sized enterprises. The question indicates here that there's 70% or more of U.S. businesses that export. So maybe if the panel could comment on some of these policies, but also some of the other things that the Biden administration may be able to do at the start here to sort of build that support for any of the external work that they might want to do. I know it's come up in the conversation, but maybe we could talk a little bit more about it in the context of these questions. Any takers?
I'll throw some things out. So I think where I'm heartened by President-elect Biden's emphasis has been, and I think Rob said this as well, trade is not a priority for the administration, right? It's very much investing at home, investing in American workers, American competitiveness. And so I think when it comes to the question of building support for trade, I don't think trade adjustment assistance is the way to go. I think we need to have pro-worker policies that are there to support workers when they struggle for whatever reason they're struggling. It may be because of trade. It is more likely to be because of robots and automation. It's harder to pin that down, but even economists have sort of provided estimates that it's much bigger. It's harder to blame those than it is foreigners, but it's reality, right? And I think that's what we should be focusing on is focusing on the workers and not shifting blame. SMEs, I think, are just really hard. I think in small economies, this can make sense. Small economies where you don't have a large enough domestic economy, and you want SMEs to have access to foreign markets to be able to grow to scale, right? In the United States, that's much less of a concern. We have a huge domestic market. You can get to scale by basically just figuring out how to, if you're currently selling in Oregon, how to expand to Washington, to California, all of those additional markets before you have to start thinking about overseas. Now, there may be some differences if you're right butting up against the border next to Canada, next to Mexico, but I think SMEs, you want to have policies that are just going to help them in general, improve the business environment for them in general, help them innovate, not so much worry about getting those folks into foreign markets. I don't think that's necessarily, where policy should necessarily be focused.
Does anyone else want to comment on that?
Yeah, Stephen, did you want to jump in?
Agree. Yeah, I generally agree. I don't think that TAA makes that much of a difference. I think if you look historically at how do you get trade agreements through the Congress, how do you build popular support for trade agreements, they tend to go through in times where people are feeling generally optimistic about the situation at home. There's a reason why NAFTA and the WTO both went through in the early 90s, and the China PNTR went through in 2000. You need to have that confidence that people have that the system is going to work for them, and that's what tends to build support for trade agreements.
Can we've got 10 minutes left. I just want to pivot to one final question before we wrap up. And I want to circle back to China, which obviously is a huge issue for this administration and undoubtedly future administrations going forward. Let me maybe strawman or stillman the different sides of the approach so far. I mean, I think certainly the Trump administration has made China a focus of a trade policy, certainly, and there are different views on how effective that's been. I think on the one hand, we clearly put a lot of tariffs on China. We got the phase 1 deal. I think there's agreement that it's fallen short in various ways, and it was a sort of down payment for a phase 2, which obviously never came around. The other views is that it's lacked coherence, and particularly that bringing allies along for this was going to be crucial in terms of being effective over the long term. Consider this sort of a straw stillman combination. So I just want to put it out to the panel. Firstly, this view of allies coming on board has been a theme for many of you throughout the discussion, and we can overstate what allies are willing to bring to the table on China and the difficulties of getting allies on board. I think certainly the European Union has been toughening up on China, and Von der Leyen has recently reached out with a very specific set of ideas about a new sort of transatlantic agenda, which includes working more closely with the US on China. My question to you is, how do you see the strategy to date, and what role specifically do we need to do? What do we see in terms of building alliances as being more effective in terms of prosecuting a longer term sort of agenda with respect to China look like?
So this may reflect my age, but before getting into international law, I had a brief career in foreign policy way back during the Cold War, and then it may still exist in some kind of defunct or revised form. We had something called COCOM, which was a way of coordinating among the allies in the West certain kinds of policies about, for example, export controls to the Soviet bloc. My observation, as I recall it, was it worked somewhat well, but not really terribly well. But I think there are some lessons from COCOM. One is don't expect, and this I think point has been made, don't expect allies to agree on everything. Part of what you want is you want a kind of ongoing conversation and channels of expert and interagency discussion across Europe and the US and Canada, Australia, about issues like Huawei. But at the end of the day, we're going to have to accept that not every country is going to be exactly on side with what we might regard as the solution that's most optimal for our national security. But I think we will find in general that even if we have at the end of the day to perhaps in some instances take a harder line than some of our allies think is appropriate, that they will respect us and more broadly maintain a cooperative relationship if we develop our approach in conversation with them, in ongoing dialogue, and not just, and of course this isn't like USTR to DG Trade necessarily. It's security agencies, it's defense ministries and so forth that are going to be involved in this kind of conversation. So I think there are some lessons we can learn from the Cold War, both positive and negative, about this kind of exercise. And when you think of the position that Australia is in now with respect to China, and Josh, as the Australian on the panel, may have something to say about it, my perception is that messages of support from the United States, including, if I recall correctly, from some members of the incoming Biden foreign policy, security policy team, make a difference in diplomacy. They make a country feel less isolated, less on its own, and less vulnerable to retaliation and escalation by a large power like China. So that's part of what Joe Nye calls, in a way, soft power, and it's something that has not been used that much or that well by the United States in recent years, as opposed to kind of the hard-hitting disruptive tweet. But it is an important part of the foreign policy toolkit, and I do think it can make a difference in countering China in instances where we very much want to counter China when it seeks to throw its power around in order to make the world safer for its anti-democratic values.
Thanks, Rob.
Josh,
can I ask David, and then I think Steve, if you can just keep your remarks brief, because we're going to have to wrap up. Thanks.
Very brief. I'll just add that I think our key allies in Asia and Europe think that our China trade policy is a failure. We haven't reduced our trade imbalance. We've lost manufacturing jobs. So I think Europeans, Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, they're willing to work with us on a new policy toward China. And in the discussion, we've covered a lot of the issues, and I won't repeat them. So.
And I would just say real quickly, I think everyone on the panel has pretty much agreed on this. I think a lot of this really does depend on the Europeans themselves. I think they have enormous self-confidence in their view of the world. I think they have great self-confidence in the way they're managing their economy and the way they're addressing a lot of these other issues. And I think it's going to largely depend on them in terms of how much they think they can use the United States and how beneficial they think we will be for them. And I think it's a very, very challenging issue.
Excellent. Look, I think we're going to wrap up now. We're coming up to 2 hours. So firstly, I want to say we've had a very rich, before I thank the panelists, we've had a great conversation. We've had a lot of issues. I think, you know, what's come across loud and clear is let's get domestic policy right and make trade policy a tool of, you know, reinvigorating the US middle class wages, addressing inequality, building manufacturing, and absolutely addressing climate change. And there was more we could have got into there. I think we had a really rich conversation around the WTO. I think we all agree it's important and it's worth keeping and building on. Pragmatically, Rob, you've made a strong case for just reinvigorating the Apollo body instead of, I think, negotiating an extended DSU reform, but there were other models out there probably worth looking at as well. David, you've spoken a lot about China. We've all spoken about China. It's clearly very complex. You had a slightly downbeat assessment, I think, of what progress can be made over the short term, but I think it's a long-term issue. It's just going to occupy us and administrations, I think, for many, many years to come. And on, you know, FTAs going forward, even there, I think there's a divergence of views about what the best strategy is there, even on an issue like CPTPP, which, you know, there are clearly very different views on whether that's the best vehicle going forward and how we build a policy around FTAs that makes sense for the US domestically and as a tool of foreign policy. So I just want to thank everyone, for the panelists, you know, very special thanks for all of you for coming on for 2 hours, dedicating your time, excellent initial presentations, and just engaging in honesty and respect with all these very difficult issues. You know, we hold different points of view, but I think we had a really productive conversation. So I want to just thank you very much, and I just want to thank the wider audience for sticking with us and for your excellent questions. Nina, and I'll just say on behalf of Brookings and AI, you know, this has been a very engaging and rich discussion. Nina, do you want to say any final words?
I think you've covered it really well. Just an additional vote of thanks to all of our panelists for joining us for a really interesting conversation. And we hope to be having a lot more of these as we go forward in this really interesting space. So thank you.
Thanks, Nina and Josh. Really a fascinating conversation, and look forward to the next episode.
Thanks, Rob.
Thanks, Rob.